In North Carolina, the home of a prominent couple becomes an unlikely scene of terrible bloodshed. Across the country, a California woman vanishes, worrying her family, and the investigators trying to find her. In a violent crime's aftermath, a spray of blood is sometimes the only clue to what happened. When nobody's talking, investigators must decipher cryptic answers written in blood. Durham, North Carolina.
Durham 911, what is your emergency?
In the early morning hours of December 9th, 2001, a 911 operator at Durham Police Headquarters received a frantic call from a man named Michael Peterson.
Cedar Street? Okay, what's wrong there, sir?
Peterson told her his wife had fallen down the stairs. She was unconscious, but still breathing.
And is she breathing, sir?
He pleaded with them to hurry. The operator dispatched an ambulance and patrol officers right away. The EMT crew arrived in minutes. In a second 911 call, Mr. Peterson had said his wife had stopped breathing. Inside, the EMTs found Michael Peterson distraught, standing over his wife. He said he found her like this. They moved him away so they could attend to her. She had lost a lot of blood. They found no pulse, no sign of breathing. Kathleen Peterson was dead. Crime scene technicians were called in. They were careful not to track anything into the area. The site of every unexpected death must be treated as a crime scene. The technicians photographed the body to document its placement and condition. They noticed a bloody footprint on the woman's calf. The technicians recorded every detail, since anything can become important later. When they were finished, they removed the body. Durham Police Sergeant Terry Wilkins worked the scene.
What I noticed was what appeared to be an unusually large amount of blood for someone to have fallen down the stairs. I've witnessed people that have had fall injuries, and I've never in 18 years of law enforcement experience seen that much blood from an accidental fall.
Michael Peterson explained what happened earlier that night.
There are a few things that we need.
He and Kathleen watched a movie and drank some wine. He thought she went to bed while he sat outside by the pool. When he came in, he found her at the bottom of the stairs. Though the death was called in as an accidental fall, Durham Police Homicide Detective Art Holland was assigned the case.
It's routine for us to respond to death investigations where there may be suspicions or possibly foul play involved.
Checked her out. She is in fact deceased. Unusual situation in that there's an extreme amount of blood in the stairway on the victim.
Sergeant Wilkins briefed the detective about what they knew so far.
She did have a large amount of blood on her person, on the bottom of her feet, on the floor, under, beside her, on the walls, on the steps. There was spatter on the walls that was very concerning.
Notice blood spatters on the wall there.
Because of the amount of blood, Holland's instinct told him it was more than a simple accident. If so, they would have to prove it.
Our crime scene technicians started photographing, videotaping, measuring the scene, which is a very time-consuming process.
They noted the placement and condition of anything that might help explain what happened that night. the technicians found 2 wine glasses in the kitchen. This fit with Michael's story that he and Kathleen shared a bottle of wine. They also found traces of blood on the cabinet where other wine glasses were kept and documented it. The blood throughout the house might be the best clue as to what happened. The investigators wanted a specialist to process it all.
One of our forensic technicians contacted the State Bureau of Investigation and requested their assistance to come do a blood spatter interpretation.
While they waited for the blood spatter expert, the investigators continued the search of the house. If it turned out to be a homicide, the mundane could become critical. From Michael Peterson's desk, they confiscated files, email printouts, floppy disks, CDs, and his personal computer. Anything that might contain useful information. That afternoon, several hours into the processing, Special Agent Dwayne Deaver of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation arrived. Investigators hoped the blood spatter expert would be able to tell them if it was an accident or murder.
An accident is going to produce a certain type of stain. It's going to be of a certain height. It's going to be of a certain quantity. And so we would look at that first. Are those things present? Do they look that way? Hey, how you doing? What have you got?
Immediately, Deaver saw signs of trouble. Smaller drops of blood mean more force was used to spray them out. In this case, the drops were very small.
Those impacts had been very forceful, much more forceful in my opinion than would have occurred from a fall.
Deaver needed to establish where Kathleen was when she started to bleed. From the shape of the drops, he first determined the angle at which the blood hit the wall. He then used strings to mark the direction the blood traveled through space. The point where the strings intersected was where the impact occurred.
I found points of origin off the surface, out in space, and that was inconsistent to me with a fall.
There was something else.
I found a transfer stain on the step right above her, where her body had been, that showed that an object that, to me, had a hook on it had been placed on that step. Perhaps that was an object used to strike the victim.
As far as the blood evidence was concerned, someone killed Kathleen Peterson. At the medical examiner's office, Dr. Deborah Radish conducted an autopsy, finding 7 head wounds.
She had lacerations close to the top of her head, at the bottom of her head, near the top of her neck.
The doctor concluded Mrs. Peterson had been beaten multiple times with a cylindrical blunt object, light enough not to cause skull fractures.
It was my opinion that her death was not as a result of falling down the stairs, and in fact, if this woman had been found anywhere else except at the bottom of a flight of stairs, there would be no question in people's minds but that she had been beaten.
At Durham Police Headquarters, a task force formed. The Petersons were a prominent couple in the community, and police anticipated the media scrutiny would be intense. But that would not affect the professionals working the case.
My main concern was that the investigation was done appropriate and done right. As far as it being high profile, that didn't bother me, and I don't think it bothered other officers.
They believed Kathleen Peterson was killed. Michael Peterson was the prime suspect. But they did not want to make an arrest until they had a solid case. The Durham investigators were determined to solve the crime. and bring the person responsible to justice. Kathleen Peterson and her grieving family deserved it. In December 2001, Durham, North Carolina authorities were trying to find the truth behind the death of Kathleen Peterson. Kathleen's husband, Michael Peterson, claimed he found her at the bottom of the stairs in their home. But police believed she was beaten to death. At the State Bureau of Investigation laboratory, forensics experts examined the evidence recovered from the Peterson house. Michael had said he and his wife shared a bottle of wine the evening before her death. Police had found 2 wine glasses on the kitchen counter. The examiner processed both glasses for fingerprints. Yet only one revealed latent prints. The other was clean. The examiner lifted the prints for comparison against those of the Petersons. Checking the prints from the wine glass against the set of prints taken from Kathleen's body, the examiner found no match. But when compared to Michael Peterson's fingerprints, they matched. Investigators wondered if Michael had staged the wine glasses on the counter after Kathleen was dead to support his story. Detective Art Holland recalled the state of one cabinet door in the kitchen.
And that cabinet door did have blood on it, which would make you think that, you know, why would there be blood on that cabinet if somebody didn't go in there after somebody was bleeding and get that glass and set it out?
Police suspected Kathleen's husband, Michael, was involved. If so, they needed to find a motive. They started with a phone records check. Detective Holland ran the check to try to determine when Kathleen last spoke with someone other than her husband.
We were able to determine that she was in fact alive at approximately 11 p.m. that night because she had made a phone call to a co-worker.
Police interviewed that co-worker to see if she could provide them with any additional information. The woman told police Kathleen called because she needed a document for a meeting the following day and asked the co-worker to email it to her. But since she was not at the office, Kathleen asked that it be sent to Michael's email address at home. Investigators wondered if Kathleen saw something else when she got the mail on her husband's computer. They sent the computer to analyst Todd Markley at CompuSleuth, a private forensic computer firm in Westerville, Ohio. Immediately, Markley saw that someone had erased many files from the hard drive the night of Kathleen's death. But that did not stop the analyst from finding those files.
The computer doesn't actually destroy anything. It puts it in to be recycled. And that information is easy to find on the hard drive if you know where to look.
Markley discovered a history of thousands of pornographic websites visited and hundreds of photographs downloaded. He also found sexually graphic emails between Michael Peterson and a prostitute.
Some of the emails were fairly explicit about what sorts of activities that they could do when they met up and how much it was going to cost.
Police wondered if Kathleen had stumbled across the emails that night and confronted Michael about them. Markley also found emails that indicated the Petersons were in financial trouble.
There were a fair number of emails that we discovered that talked about finances and money, asking friends for money.
Peterson had even tried to cash out one of Kathleen's life insurance policies so he could receive the money that had accrued. Authorities needed to know more about the Petersons' financial status. Officers visited Kathleen's place of work and spoke to the human resources director there. She told them Kathleen was a valued executive, but because of company-wide downsizing, she was on the possible layoff list.
We went there to get records, her employment records, life insurance records to see if there was something in those records that would give Michael Peterson a reason to take her life. And we did find just that.
Kathleen had a life insurance policy that paid out $1.4 million if she died in an accident. It was a powerful financial motive. Yet, if Michael Peterson had killed his wife, police needed to know what kind of weapon he used.
You know, we searched that house from the attic to the basement. We did grid searches of the outside, try to locate any type of instrument that could have caused the blunt force trauma to Kathleen's head.
They found nothing that matched the hook-shaped bloodstain on the stairs. The investigation stalled. Police were becoming concerned that without the murder weapon, they might never solve this case. Then, the information they so desperately sought came to them. Kathleen's sister asked to talk with the detectives. She said the family had some information the police should know about. The sister told Detective Holland she had bought a distinctive fireplace tool called a blowpoke for everyone in the family years earlier. She had used the one at Kathleen's house just a few weeks before her sister's death to stoke a fire. But now, it was gone.
She had a blowpoke exactly like the one that she gave her sister Kathleen. And she wanted for me to see exactly what this instrument looked like and take it to the medical examiner's office to show it to the doctors there to see if it was possible that this type of instrument could have caused the trauma to Kathleen's head.
The medical examiner, Dr. Deborah Radish, had already determined that the wounds were caused by a cylindrical, blunt object.
And the blowpoke fit that description. What was interesting about the blowpoke was that it was not as heavy as, say, a regular fireplace poker. It had a thick brass wall, but it was hollow on the inside. And that could explain, in this particular case, why the lacerations of the scalp were so severe, but why she suffered no skull fractures.
Authorities knew they were getting close. But at the State Bureau of Investigation lab, Special Agent Dwayne Deaver and other experts still had work to do. They next examined the clothing the Petersons wore on the night Kathleen died. They wanted to know if bloodstain patterns on the clothing further supported their theory that Michael Peterson beat Kathleen to death. The team checked the shorts Michael had on when police arrived, looking for the distinctive spatter a beating would create.
When I looked at Michael Peterson's shorts, those impact spatters were there, in the crotch, on the inside of the leg of the pants, even having traveled and gotten on the inside of the pants first.
That is an indication that the person wearing the shorts was standing over a source of blood at the time that it was impacted.
They also wanted to compare the shoes to the bloody tread mark found on the back of Kathleen's pants. Using fingerprint powder and electrostatic contact sheets, they made a print of the bottom of the shoes. Comparing it to the mark on the pants, they found an exact match.
Now this indicates that she is face down. The blood spatters on the front of her pants indicate that she's face up.
She was beaten in several different positions over a period of time. At one time, she appeared to be on her hands and knees, at one time on her back, at one time in a crouched position as if she were trying to go up the stairwell.
It had been a prolonged attack, brutal and bloody, one that Michael Peterson denied ever happened, but one all the evidence pointed toward. Still, investigators needed to prove it in court. After the death of Kathleen Peterson in Durham, North Carolina, two very different stories emerged regarding the night of December 9th, 2001. Kathleen's husband, Michael Peterson, claimed that they had a normal night. Police were told the couple shared a bottle of wine and enjoyed a quiet, romantic evening like they had so many times before. Michael suggested to police perhaps Kathleen had more to drink than he thought, and that maybe she was drunk when she fell down the stairs. But only his prints were on the wine glasses. Durham authorities had a different version of what happened. They believed Michael Peterson brutally beat his wife to death with a fireplace blowpoke. At the State Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab, Special Agent Dwayne Deaver conducted a series of experiments using goat's blood to try to duplicate the blood spatter he found at the scene.
We went back and looked at falls, exaggerated falls from heights of 12 feet with a person who was already bloody for some reason. And we looked at those scenarios to see what kind of patterns would be produced and if they were comparable to the patterns that we saw on the walls. And we did not find any fall type actions that could produce the things that we saw in this particular case.
Then, Deaver tried to duplicate the blood spatter by mimicking a beating death. Dressed in clothes similar to those worn by Michael Peterson, he placed the goat's blood on a sponge, then struck it with a blowpoke. He found the action produced blood spatter very similar to the patterns found in the home and on the clothing.
Careful forensic analysis of the blood stains on the clothing, the walls, on everyone's clothing that was involved showed that this was not a fall, that in fact the individual had been beaten severely over a period of time in different positions and by the individual that told us that it was an accident.
During a 2-month trial in 2003, District Attorney Jim Hardin explained to a jury what the evidence showed happened that night.
It was very clear that he was attempting to engage in extramarital affairs. We presented a strong case that she found out about his attempt to engage in an extramarital relationship. I personally believe that she confronted him about it, and because of the conflict in the family revolving around Miss Peterson's jeopardy of losing her job, the financial situation that they had placed themselves in, I think that it was a trigger, it was a catalyst, and I think Mr. Peterson lost his temper and beat her to death and then attempted to cover it up.
Michael Peterson believed he stood to make $1.4 million from his wife's death. But what he received was life in prison.
The importance of the forensic evidence in this case cannot be overemphasized. Had it not been for the quick thinking of several of the folks at the scene initially to bring a blood spatter expert to that location while we had the house in our custody, I don't know that we would have gotten this result.
Careful bloodstain analysis finally brought answers to the family of Kathleen Peterson. Across the country, another woman's family faced terrifying questions of their own. Lodi, California, a small city nestled in the San Joaquin Valley, south of Sacramento. Lodi sees fewer than 5 murders per year, so most citizens feel safe. But on December 17, 1990, Lodi resident Charles Abbott was growing concerned. He couldn't find his wife. A man had phoned him hours earlier saying he found Susan Abbott's purse. Charles retrieved the purse, then called friends and family members. No one had heard from Susan that day. Her sister wanted Charles to call police.
Lodi 911, what is your emergency?
The 911 operator took down the relevant information and dispatched a patrol officer to the Abbott house. The officer arrived just as Susan's sister was pulling up. Charles had asked her to come. He was worried about Susan. The close-knit family always stuck together. Charles said he called Susan's work. She had not shown up that morning.
Well, it's not like her.
The officer asked when Charles last saw his wife.
Dropped me off at work.
It was so great.
Charles explained it was around 8 o'clock that morning. His truck was in the shop for repairs, so Susan drove him to work. They left the house a little before 8. She dropped him off, and he assumed she continued on to the hospital where she worked. His truck would be ready that afternoon, so she did not plan to pick him up. Everything seemed fine when he last saw her. Charles said when he came home that afternoon, he got the call from the man who found Susan's purse.
And it's not like her.
He went to the man's house to pick it up. The man said he found it in a dumpster behind a local Mexican restaurant.
It's right here.
Susan's credit cards and a large amount of cash were missing. They had just sold a car, and Susan had $4,000 with her, which she was going to deposit that day. They could not think of a reason why Susan would want to leave. At the officer's request, Charles gave him a recent photo of Susan.
4 months ago.
He said that day she was actually wearing the same sweater as she was in the picture.
About 4 months ago.
By the next morning, there was still no word from Susan Abbott.
Hey, Bill.
And Detective Sergeant Bill Barry was assigned the case.
I just took this report from.
He knew it was possible Susan simply left.
Seems kind of hinky to me. That's why I taught you.
But if so, he still had to find her to let her family know she was safe.
People do walk away from their lives. Sometimes there's a mental health issue, sometimes they are unhappy with their lives, sometimes there's something going on we don't know about. But what you hope for is that you're going to find them okay.
Sergeant Barry began a routine missing persons investigation.
We gather basic information about someone who's missing, their physical description, height, weight, date of birth, the car that the missing person may have been last seen in or was associated with. We immediately get a bulletin out to law enforcement agencies in the area, along with our officers who are on the street.
To follow up on the purse, an officer went to interview the man who reportedly found it. He confirmed that he found the purse in a restaurant's dumpster while he was salvaging cardboard.
Where the liquid dumpsters?
There was no money and no credit cards inside. He saw Susan's ID and called to return it.
All black, yeah.
The officer took down the name of the restaurant where the dumpster was. The man had no criminal record, and a later search of his property yielded no clues. Police believed his story.
Okay.
The dumpster was impounded, and Sergeant Barry and other officers began showing the missing woman's photo around the strip mall near the Mexican restaurant.
Because of the circumstances, you are worried that some harm has come to this person. You want to do your best to try to locate them, get them recovered, get them back with people who love them.
Some clerks recognized Susan as a regular customer, but no one reported seeing her recently. The case grew more ominous with the next lead. Susan's van had been found in a parking lot several miles from the Abbott house.
On my way down there, I was hoping that what it would do is provide some indication as to what happened to her, something that would lead us to her. I didn't know what to anticipate, but I was at least hopeful that we might find something.
Looks like you got it, huh?
There was no sign of Susan Abbott. The van was parked and locked next to a bank near an ATM.
Anything unusual looking at this point? The bank was closed. There was no one around the vehicle. It was just parked normally as if somebody had parked it there and gone into the bank but just never came back.
Charles Abbott made the discovery along with two friends.
They told me that they had gone out driving around after making the initial report to the officer to try to locate Susan's car. Charles said he'd remembered that Susan had about $4,000 in cash that she was going to take to the bank that day, so he decided to go by the bank and see if her car was there.
The men said they had not touched the van.
The car was clean, sitting by itself, no disturbance to it. Looked like it had just come off a used car lot.
Berry prepared it to be towed to the police impound yard.
One thing that did stand out in the vehicle was 2 boxes of plastic trash bags in the back seat. One of them was opened. We didn't know what those connected to at that point.
And we thought that odd, given the general absence of any contents in the car.
It was possible someone had seen Susan with the cash and abducted her from the bank. Police hoped some evidence inside the vehicle would help explain what happened and tell them where Susan Abbott was so they could find her and bring her back to her family. On December 17, 1990, 35-year-old Susan Abbott was reportedly last seen dropping her husband off at work in Lodi, California. That afternoon, a man found her empty purse in a dumpster. And the next day, her husband discovered her van abandoned near a bank. Recovering the purse and vehicle was a bad sign for Detective Sergeant Bill Berry.
Under ordinary circumstances, someone just doesn't throw their purse away in a garbage dumpster, doesn't just leave their car parked at a bank and walk away from those things. It's possible, but it's unlikely. And at that point, we were concerned that Susan may be the victim of foul play.
Investigators went back to the Abbott house. They needed more information from Charles.
Hi, Mr. Abbott. Yes. Hi, Detective Berry. Remember me from last
Perhaps there were answers in the details of Susan's last known actions.
Looks like you've got someplace where we can sit
Charles
down.
told the detective about the money Susan had with her. But Charles said the last time he saw her was when she dropped him off at work.
May help us to. No,
He did not think anyone else knew about the money and could not think of anyone who would want to harm Susan.
He said he wanted to take it for a test drive.
Then, 2 days after Susan Abbott disappeared, investigators' fears came true.
Sergeant Berry.
On December 19th, Sergeant Berry received a call from the San Joaquin Sheriff's Department. Someone had found a body.
ETA is about 30 minutes.
Lodi detectives responded to a railroad trestle in rural San Joaquin County, 20 miles outside of Lodi. The initial clothing description matched what Susan was wearing.
When we arrived here, we were briefed by the detectives from the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Department. They had taken photographs of her face. We compared those to the photograph that had been given us by Charles, and it was obvious that this was one and the same person.
A man dumping some tires had found her. He had not seen anyone around. With no witnesses, they had to read the scene for clues.
The victim, Susan Abbott, was laying on her back at the bottom of this railroad trestle. Her arms were folded up slightly, her legs were slightly bent, so it indicated to us she'd been in a confined space when she went into rigor.
She had a head injury that appeared to be a gunshot wound, but there was little blood, itself a clue for Lodi homicide detective Stephen Price.
Considering her injury, the clothing was very clean. Her body and facial area appeared to be very clean. If she had been murdered at this scene, there would have been a lot of blood that would have been consistent with the type of injury. There's very little blood in the area, so it would indicate to me that the murder occurred somewhere else. We began doing a thorough grid-type search, looking for any evidence that might be present in the area, not just at the location of the victim, but also on the ingress or exit routes.
There were no discernible footprints or tire tracks.
We found no indications of a struggle, no shell casings, no other evidence at the scene. She'd been carried out there carefully and placed on the ground.
The body was removed for autopsy.
We knew that it would have been very difficult for someone to have placed Susan's body in its location by themselves. Carrying her to that location, putting her down, would have been difficult for one person. Also, somebody had to drop Susan's vehicle off outside the bank. and we knew that these things indicated that there was a likelihood of a second individual.
The investigation shifted immediately.
Once you know you have a murder, obviously the investigation kicks up into high gear. We put all of the resources that we had available into working this case. It's very critical in the first few days of a murder case that you work all the available leads.
Police needed to do a more thorough interview with Charles, routine for a murder investigation.
Her husband is a natural suspect. The person who last saw her is a natural suspect. In this case, they were the same person, Charles Abbott. You need to ask questions about whether there has been domestic disturbances. Had they argued recently? Were there disagreements about money? Things that might play into a motivation for murder.
Charles said he and Susan had been getting along fine. No financial trouble, no marital problems. The detective asked about weapons, and Charles said he had 2 rifles and a .22 caliber pistol.
We talked to Charles about what his activities were the day Susan went missing.
They needed to create a minute-by-minute timeline.
She had dropped him off at the storage unit where he operated his electrician business. He went into his storage unit, arranged some materials that he was going to use during the day, and then walked to an auto body shop where his truck was being repaired.
He learned his truck would not be ready for several hours.
He rented a car, and then he went about doing some of his jobs. Then ultimately he brought the rental car back to the rental car company, dropped it off, and was taken back over to the auto body shop where he picked up his truck. From there he went home.
The detectives noted the time and place of each step. While the interview continued, the autopsy began. Pathologist Bill Maduros led the post-mortem examination. He determined the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. The doctor noted something odd. There was almost no blood left in the body, yet her clothing was clean.
So I suspect that she wasn't wearing this clothing when she was shot.
Her skin was clean, too.
Not only was she redressed, but probably washed and cleaned up.
This was very unusual for a murder. Checking the skin around the entrance wound, the pathologist determined it had been an execution.
I'm not an expert on guns, but I can safely say it was larger than a .22.
Investigators believe the murder weapon was a .357 or .38 caliber handgun. But no evidence suggested who fired it. While the autopsy was being conducted, police continued to look at Charles Abbott. Sergeant Barry ran a records check on him. There was no criminal record. He had several guns registered to him, the rifles and .22 caliber pistol he had mentioned, but there was another, a .357 Magnum.
We talked to him about weapons. He omitted any mention of a .357 revolver.
Investigators believe the murder weapon might have been a .357.
Hey, Bill.
Suspicion was settling over Charles Abbott. Then, another ominous lead.
About 3 days into the investigation, a call came into our dispatch center. The caller told our dispatcher anonymously that Charles Abbott had solicited someone to have his wife killed. The caller gave a couple of different names.
But each man named was incarcerated at the time of the murder. If Charles Abbott had tried to hire them, he was unsuccessful. Perhaps he found someone else to help him, or he did the job himself. After the December 1990 murder of Susan Abbott in Lodi, California, suspicion focused on her husband, Charles. The suspect had given Detective Sergeant Bill Berry a detailed account of his actions on the day Susan disappeared. It included going to the storage unit where he kept work equipment and renting a car for the day. Berry secured the records of the electronic card key system at the storage unit.
It had in fact logged his partner, who had come into the storage unit that morning and had left a few minutes later. But there was no record of Charles Abbott's card being used any time during that day.
Next, the detective wanted to check the route Charles said he drove that day in the car he rented.
We had gone over in some detail his movements during that day, and we had done that twice.
Berry had turn-by-turn directions.
A simple check on Charles's alibi was to drive the route with the rental car and to check that mileage from that route against what was on the rental agreement. We saw that that did not match up, that there was a substantial discrepancy between the two.
Charles Abbott's alibi was crumbling, but investigators needed hard evidence to prove he was involved in Susan's murder. Lodi Police crime scene technicians carefully processed the dumpster where the victim's purse was found.
We ultimately found household trash, a toothpaste tube box, a top to a napkin box, items which didn't really fit what we would have expected to find.
What do we have here?
More significantly than that, we found bloody towels.
The technicians also recovered the box to a bar of soap and the top to a tissue box. Uncertain which of these items might prove important to the case, investigators marked everything and collected it for later study in the crime lab.
The towels that we found in the dumpster were stained with blood, and there was also hair adhering to them. An examination of the blood found it to be O positive, which was a match for Susan's blood type. And the hair was found to be, under microscopic examination, consistent with samples of Susan's hair.
Police finally had enough circumstantial evidence to get a warrant to search the Abbott house. If it was Susan's blood on the towels, they might have come from the house. The murder might have taken place there. Officers removed Charles Abbott from the house, standard procedure for a search. They placed him in protective custody so the scene could be completely processed.
We're going to have you stand by here until we conduct.
They were looking for blood, ballistics, the murder weapon, anything that would show where Susan was shot. In the bedroom, technicians discovered minute specks of blood. They were on a wall near the bed, almost invisible to the naked eye. The technicians knew that blood spatter that tiny meant it came from a high-velocity spray, often seen in gunshot cases. They also noticed something on the floor of the bedroom. A lead fragment, likely the jacket of a large caliber bullet.
You might have a jacket here.
Yeah, that looks like it could be a large caliber too. I mean, that's
Yeah.
quite a bit of jacket.
Yeah,
It looks like possibly a hollow point round.
Police
Yeah.
believe a .357 was used to kill Susan. In the dresser, they discovered a wallet containing Susan Abbott's credit cards, cards that Charles said had been taken from her purse.
We'll do. All right, thanks.
In the bathroom, investigators found more incriminating evidence.
We found a number of towels in the house. We recognized the patterns as being similar to the ones that we had found in the dumpster. We went and got the towels from the dumpster and compared the two and found that they were an exact match.
In the trash, they recovered more of Susan's credit cards. Evidence technicians swabbed the drain of the bathtub. They discovered traces of human blood. Investigators knew the body had bled out before it was dumped, and the body's position had indicated it was in a confined space, like a bathtub. Investigators still hope to find the murder weapon.
We obtained search warrants for Charles's storage unit because once we had searched the house, we still had not located the gun. And the storage unit was an obvious location where it might be. As we searched the storage unit, we came across a number of items that were very significant to us.
There was no gun, but officers did find a box of .357 caliber ammunition.
It was a box of 50 and there were 6 missing. We knew that the weapon that was likely used was a .357. So there was some potential that these rounds obviously were the ones that were used to load the weapon.
The investigators also discovered information on dating services, including correspondence with mail-order brides. They recalled Charles had said his marriage was a solid one.
When we found those materials, it indicated to us quite the opposite, that he was interested in pursuing relationships with other women.
Additionally, the officers found leaflets for get-rich-quick schemes and other documents that showed Charles Abbott was having financial difficulties.
And this, of course, played into the possible motivation that collecting life insurance might be a motive for him to commit this crime.
To strengthen their case, investigators wanted to try and match the top of the tissue box found in the dumpster to the tissue box taken from the Abbott house. Using a comparison microscope, a trained examiner like Donald Morian can see if the minute fibers match up side by side.
You have to examine it microscopically to look at the way the fibers of the actual box, the paper fibers, cross. You have to match those fibers up to generally say that this piece of top was a part of this box originally.
One shot killed Susan Abbott. Investigators wanted to know what kind of gun fired that shot. Forensic tests on the bullet fragments found in the bedroom were consistent with one fired from a .357 Magnum, a gun Charles Abbott owned but could not produce for police. Although police never found the murder weapon, they now believed they had enough evidence to prove Charles Abbott killed his wife. He was arrested and tried for murder. In June of 1992, District Attorney Thomas Testa presented the jury what the evidence showed happened on December 16, 1990.
The night Susan Abbott was murdered, from all the evidence, we believe Charles Abbott went behind her, put his gun to her head, and pulled the trigger and shot her through the head, a contact wound to the back of the head. He then took her body into the bathroom, into the bathtub, and let it bleed out in that bathtub. Put new clothes on the body, new red, bright, visible clothes. Took her body out and laid her body out, not under the railroad trestle where it would be hidden, but near the railroad trestle, but in an area where she would be visible in that bright red outfit, because he wanted her to be found. She had to be found in order for him later to collect the insurance.
Charles Abbott was charged and convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison.
That's going to look like...
When a killer's deceit masks the crime, police must turn to forensic experts to decipher the truth, written in blood.
Okay.
A Missouri man is shot in the head on a deserted country road. Is it murder? The only clue, a shredded bullet. Identifying the gun that fired it will be nearly impossible. In Florida, a man is beaten to death in his home. Police uncover fingerprints and rumors of an exotic weapon.
That's what it looks like.
For law enforcement, the toughest opponent is often an assassin with no clear ties to the victim. Using science as their most powerful weapon, investigators must find these hired killers and make them pay the true price of murder. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Hillsboro, Missouri is a small town located a few miles west of the Mississippi River. On November 21st, 2000, on a stretch of commercial property owned by a chemical manufacturing plant just outside Hillsboro, a security guard spotted a vehicle sitting in a field. He discovered a man in the driver's seat, slumped over the steering wheel. The man was unresponsive. He was bleeding from a wound in the back of his head. The security guard called 911.
Jefferson County 911, what is your emergency? A man in a field.
A dispatcher alerted units from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department.
7214, 6017.
Within minutes, paramedics and deputies were on the scene. But for the man who lay motionless in the driver's seat, it was too late. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the area and called in crime scene investigators. Detective William McDaniel took charge of the case.
When I pulled up, there was a car partially off a gravel roadway, had a white male slumped at the wheel. The rear passenger side window was shattered. It looked like from a bullet. The security guard found him.
Okay, I guess what we'll do then.
The evidence suggested to Detective Michael Gray the car was moving when the man was shot.
We can do it here.
When the vehicle was found, it was in gear. His foot was still on the brake pedal. We surmised that the vehicle was traveling at idle speed. We initially were looking at the possibility of it being hunting related simply because of the time of year. The area in question is known for a lot of hunting.
Detectives examined the car inside and out in search of any clues. Some 30 feet away on the dirt road, investigators found shards of glass. They believe the bullet struck the car and driver here, after which he drove straight off the road. The driver was removed from the vehicle and identified by his license. His name was Larry Holman, a 44-year-old from nearby Hillsboro. The victim's wife was contacted. Detective McDaniel knew the victim from around town. He was a church-going family man, not a man prone to have many enemies.
Open up the right door.
He was also an avid hunter.
Yeah, I pulled him down the road. The security guard revealed that the subject was in the field area scouting for deer for possible hunting locations. It's the last day of deer season, and there had been reports of poachers on the property. The car is in a field where the deer cross, so there's a chance that somebody may have thought it was a deer moving across the field.
Detectives turned to forensics to find the source of the deadly shot.
Well, the important thing was to try to determine the direction the projectile came from. Once we got a direction, we'd have a line on where to search for any items of forensic evidence, any shell casings, items left behind. That's why it was important to try to position everything back in its original location. We repositioned the vehicle back on the road. We figured out a trajectory angle based upon the approximate head height of the gentleman. It was a matter of setting up a tripod, taking a trajectory string, and then just extrapolating back into the wooded area.
Holman had been shot from behind, the bullet passing through the window and the car's headrest before killing him.
Okay, that's good.
Police used this information to reconstruct the bullet's path.
We ran the trajectory angle back from the vehicle at about 40 to 50 feet away near the wood line. The trajectory string was at about shoulder height, which would be consistent with an individual taking aim or firing with a weapon.
I like that. What do you think?
Be right real close.
Investigators scoured the woods in that area, looking for potential evidence left by a careless hunter. But police came up empty-handed. No shell casings, cigarette butts, or any clues to help explain what happened. A sheriff's deputy interviewed the security guard at the entrance to the property. He was the last person to see Larry Holman alive. Police hoped the guard might recall some small clue to help them find the killer. The guard had known the victim. Larry had worked there and hunted on the property often. On the day of his death, Larry Holman arrived alone and in good spirits. It was his day off work, and he told the guard he would be out in the field scouting for deer. According to a sign-in sheet,
Yes, sir, it is.
Holman had entered the property at 4:20 in the afternoon.
Holman there. Yes, sir.
He would never sign out.
Correct. Mrs. Holman?
Yes.
Police spoke with the victim's wife, Tammy, to see if she could shed any additional light on the investigation.
I need to speak to you about your husband.
I don't understand.
She said she had last seen him the morning he was killed. The couple had been married nearly 15 years. She described her marriage as happy and could think of no one who wished Larry harm. She wasn't able to provide any additional information. An autopsy was performed, though it offered few clues that could point to a perpetrator. According to the coroner's report, Larry Holman died instantly. A high-velocity slug was retrieved from his skull, but it was unidentifiable. The bullet's lead core was gone. Only a mangled copper jacket survived. Investigators hope to recover more pieces of the bullet in the victim's car.
See if we can preserve that.
The projectile, it had fragmented when it penetrated the glass. When we processed the vehicle, we found some fragments from the projectile embedded in the headrest of the driver's seat. So we decided to retrieve that in the attempt to try to determine the caliber of the weapon and maybe the ammunition that was used.
At the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab, forensics expert Todd Garrison was charged with putting the bullet back together again.
First, it hit a window of an automobile. Secondary impact was the headrest of the automobile. The third impact was the victim's head. Each one of those impacts contributing a little bit more to its damage and distortion.
Garrison analyzed the size and weight of the pieces.
One of the copper fragments out of the headrest had rifling engraving on it that was similar to the rifling engraving that was observed on the bullet out of the victim's head.
He determined that he was looking at pieces of a .243 caliber bullet.
Generally, the .243 Winchester caliber is associated with a hunting type rifle, as for deer, large game.
At the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, detectives formed a task force. If this was a hunting accident, it would be nearly impossible to solve.
Guys, watch.
Thousands of hunters passed through the area.
30, 40 feet up.
Detective Gray laid out what little they did know.
Okay, so you're saying about
You have an individual who's what we term low risk. The guy's a family man. The guy had no known enemies. did not live a lifestyle that would be conducive to violence.
Investigators, however, were not yet willing to declare the case an
I think
accident.
I'm going to take the four names like the wood line.
Something didn't seem right.
Glass, which we are...
Accidental shots usually end up somewhere else on the body. Headshots are usually an aimed shot. When you start thinking about the laws of probability, we have a moving target, small rear window, the thickness of the woods. It did not look like an accident.
Talk to some residents.
Police officially labeled the death suspicious, but they had no leads to point them to the killer. It seemed the investigators had come to the end of their trail of evidence. Weeks turned into months, and no new clues surfaced. Police issued press releases throughout the small community, asking the public for help. By January, little headway had been made on the case. Then, police got a break from an unlikely source.
Hi, Detective. Okay.
Tammy Holman, the victim's widow, told investigators about a series of unsettling letters she had been receiving.
Yes, I did. It's weird.
After her husband was shot, a man named Carter Davis began writing her love letters.
You know, it's just kind of fishy.
Tammy said she had rebuffed him, but he would not leave her alone. She turned his letters over to police. "I love you and won't let you go," read one. "We're soulmates," read another. The detective's interview with Holman's widow left them with some questions.
Wouldn't say who he was.
No, he wouldn't say who he was.
They knew that a man named Alan Tripp had moved in with her shortly after her husband was killed.
Check on this.
Mrs. Holman started to look suspicious to us. Her actions didn't really correspond with a grieving widow. It began to expand our investigation.
Detectives ran Tammy's name through the system. Her record was clean. But they also knew her name did appear on another significant document. Larry Holman's insurance policy offered a payout of $125,000. He had an additional policy of $2 million if he died in a hunting accident. The beneficiary was his wife. For detectives, what started as a simple accident was now looking like it might be cold-blooded murder. In November 2000, Missouri deer hunter Larry Holman was found dead in a field. He'd been shot in the head with a .243 caliber bullet fired from a hunting rifle. At first, it appeared as if it was an accident, but police were beginning to have their doubts. They weren't the only ones. In January 2001, the victim's brother, Randy Holman, turned in a .243 Winchester bolt-action rifle. He knew the police were looking for that type of weapon and suspected Larry's death was no accident. Randy feared the killer was someone his brother knew who may have used this gun to murder him.
Okay. If you want to have a seat right there.
Jefferson County Detective William McDaniel.
We interviewed Randy Holman, brother of Larry Holman. He actually brought in a deer rifle of Larry's, and he wanted us to do a comparison of the deer rifle to the ballistic round, what was found at the crime scene.
At the time of the murder, the gun had been stored at the home of Larry and Tammy Holman.
I ended up getting it from Tammy.
Randy had good reason to suspect his brother was murdered.
Yeah, you said you had
He told police his brother Larry had been shot at before.
We were at my parents' place.
Days before his death, Larry had gone hunting deep in the Missouri woods.
Randy stated that he and Larry had had a conversation later in the night after hunting. Larry stated that he had a close call. And Randy asked, "Well, what do you mean by a close call?" And he goes, "Well, I had a bullet whiz by my head." Because there was so much gun activity up in the northern part of Missouri during deer season. And they kind of joked about it.
But now, he knew it was no joke. and wondered if Larry had been shot with his own gun.
Heavily hunted. I didn't think much about it.
He just wished that that gun would be ruled out so that way he knew the gun had no involvement into his brother's death.
Alan, thanks for coming by.
Investigators sent the gun to ballistics and began interviewing suspects. First on their list was Alan Tripp, the widow's new love interest.
You know what we want to talk to you about?
Tripp had grown up with Tammy Holman and came to her side shortly after Larry's death.
Oh, I've known her since grade school. We went to grade school.
Within the last couple months, Alan Tripp had moved in with Mrs. Holman and actually gave her an engagement ring.
No.
His actions raised some red flags with us. He stated he had no knowledge of the incident, that he had spoke to Mrs. Holman several times about the so-called accident, and she stated that there was nothing there.
Calling her all the time.
Investigators also sought out a local man named Carter Davis.
Yeah, he's right over there clearing that table.
Tammy said Davis had become infatuated with her, showering her with flowers and love letters.
I need to ask you some questions about...
Letters that concerned Tammy Holman. Like Tripp, he insisted he had nothing to do with the crime.
Tammy and I are friends.
At one time, Carter Davis actually put a note on Alan Tripp's car which said, "Did you kill him?" And he just believed that Alan Tripp had something to do with his death.
But other than that, she's never said much.
Police had also gotten a very interesting lead. They learned that Tripp and Davis were not the only men close to Tammy Holman.
We received an anonymous phone call. It was a male subject.
The caller suggested they check out the alibi of a third man.
It was a male caller?
The tipster said Charles Miller had a gun similar to the one police were looking for. McDaniel checked Miller's record for any previous arrests. Miller had a record. He had been arrested for check fraud. A few days later, on January 9th, 2001, investigators caught another break.
Okay, thank you. Have a seat.
Nice to meet you.
A woman gave police new information on the case.
Some information I don't know if you can use.
She told Detective McDaniel that she lived near the field where Holman was shot. For several days leading up to the crime, she observed a suspicious-looking man with a gun walking near the crime scene. McDaniel showed the woman a lineup. She identified Charles Miller without hesitation.
Yeah, right there, I'm sure.
Within hours, they had their man in sight.
Miller!
Charles Miller was arrested and brought in for questioning. He admitted he was a friend of the Holmans, but claimed to know nothing of the crime.
He's good.
They had attended Sunday schools together. Miller would come over and do work around the Holman's house. He would bring eggs, he would bring, bacon, and so Tammy would cook breakfast in the morning for him and Larry.
Miller offered to cooperate with investigators.
Mr. Miller gave us permission to do a consent to search on firearms that he had owned. We were only looking for high-powered rifles, and he actually gave us 3 rifles, one being a Browning Bolt A-Action 243.
Deputies also seized boxes of .243 caliber ammunition and cell phone records, which indicated that Miller had called the Holman residence on the day of the crime.
Once the gun was seized from Charlie Miller during the consent to search, it was delivered to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab in Jeff City for a ballistic match.
Criminalist Todd Garrison examined Miller's rifle, as well as Larry Holman's gun brought in by his brother Randy.
I test fired both of the rifles in question. From those, I obtained bullets, which I could do microscopic comparisons between. I eliminated the .243 Winchester caliber Savage rifle.
The rifle taken from the victim's home was not involved. That left Charles Miller's gun. There were key similarities, but damage to the bullet recovered from the body prevented a 100% match.
I did observe the rifling engraving and also isolated agreements of some individual characteristics. Not enough to say, yes, this firearm did fire this bullet, but enough that it was consistent with that particular firearm.
The forensics seemed to point squarely at Charles Miller. He was now their prime suspect. Miller, already in custody, was interrogated by Detective McDaniel.
Is there something that we need to talk about? He was not a very emotional person. He asked us questions if this was about his gun. We explained to him, yes, it was about his gun we seized. And he bowed his head and he looked back up and he said, I killed him.
I killed him.
It took us all for a shock. And we find out later, Mr. Miller was a very church-going person, and I believe this was eating him up inside.
You know what kind of
Police now had a confession, but what Miller was about to tell them would blow the case wide open.
Who owns a .243?
In Jefferson County, Missouri, an accident investigation had uncovered a homicide. Police had a suspect in custody, Charles Miller.
Charlie, you know why we're here?
And when presented with the forensic evidence, he confessed. But the confession was only the beginning.
Charles Miller got, I guess, infatuated with Mrs. Holman. He stated to us that he always thought she was a very well-kept woman. He and Mrs. Holman began a relationship without Mr. Holman's knowledge.
Miller told police he and Tammy were close, and her husband was becoming concerned.
I thought Tammy knew that you killed
He went on to say Tammy asked him to kill Larry.
Tammy's the one who made
She wanted it done during hunting season to make it appear as if it was an accident. Miller believed that with Larry dead, he and Tammy would be free to live the life he dreamed of. Miller had tried once and missed. November 21st was his last chance, the final day of hunting season.
Mr. Miller got down to the property about 2 o'clock and actually watched Mr. Holman drive into the field. Miller was up the road a ways and positioned against a tree. And as Mr. Holman started to leave the property, he took the shot. And he watched Mr. Holman slump, his head go forward and rest on the steering wheel, and the car veered off.
Police believe he then packed up his rifle, picked up his shell casings, and left the scene. It was then that he made the call to Tammy Holman.
He told her to set one less place at the dinner table.
On January 10, 2001, detectives arrested Tammy Holman for the murder of her husband.
Tammy?
Charlie Miller was basically double-crossed by Mrs. Holman. He thought he was going to get to live the life that Larry Holman lived, and instead she pulls Alan Tripp in, who is now taking over Larry's position in the family. She was a black widow, and she had all these lovers out there, and she kind of used them all to do her dirty work for her.
Charles Miller pled guilty to second-degree murder and is serving a 25-year prison sentence. Tammy Holman was sentenced to 7 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. A sniper's bullet will often give him away, but a hitman who uses a more obscure weapon poses an added challenge for police. November 7th, 1995, 8:31 p.m. A 911 dispatcher received a frantic call from a woman in Green Cove Springs, Florida.
We'll get somebody out there, okay?
The caller, Linda Jones, reported that 3 men had broken in and ransacked her home. Jones said that she had been tied up, her husband severely beaten. Deputies from the Clay County Sheriff's Department rushed to the address. On the lookout for 3 intruders, they approached the home with caution.
I'm so glad you guys are here. I'm looking in with my husband.
I just need for you to wait for me. Tell me what's going on.
A deputy secured the living room. The assailants appeared to have fled. Linda's husband, Jack Jones, lay on the floor in a puddle of blood, his hands and feet bound with duct tape. He was not breathing. The deputy began CPR. Distraught and inconsolable, his wife could offer few lucid details. Paramedics rushed onto the scene. As deputies tried to gain a description of the attackers, they did not have much to go on. Linda said the men wore ski masks. The rest was a blur. Lieutenant Tom Waugh was assigned the case.
We were told that 3 masked assailants entered the residence. They had some kind of a club or bat with them, and they had tied her up, tied up her husband, and literally beat him with this weapon. And then they went through the residence and stole various items, such as money and jewelry.
Paramedics examined Linda Jones. Her injuries seemed minor. She complained of tingling and pain in her left arm and was taken to a local hospital for treatment. Her husband was not as fortunate. Jack Jones was dead.
The crime scene itself was very violent.
We noticed right off the bat a lot of blood. There was blood on the floor because there was blood spatter on the wall, and it appears that he was drugged into an adjacent room. And on the wall, as he rounded the corner, it looked as if he had his hands on the door corner trying to hold himself back. And then once he was in the other room, that is where he was literally beaten to death.
Pieces of duct tape were scattered throughout the house, along with a partially used roll. Officials believed it had likely been used on the wife. She too had been tied up, she told deputies, but tore herself free before calling police. The reason for the break-in appeared less clear the more detectives looked around. Valuables were found in plain view.
It was made to look like it was ransacked, you know, just disheveled.
Jewelry, an expensive watch, a man's wallet with cash and credit cards were all left behind.
Those are the things that you can turn the fastest. They would have been gone. And why would you leave money? Why would you leave jewelry? Didn't seem right.
At the hospital, deputies took a statement from Linda Jones
Jack and I were sitting in the living room.
and fingerprints to help eliminate those found at the house.
Break short, huh?
She claimed her wrists were tied and her mouth sealed shut with duct tape. But something about her story didn't sit right with detectives.
They threw me against the fire.
You would have some signs of that. There wasn't any redness on her mouth or her face. That didn't seem quite right, because normally duct tape will leave a residue, or they'll leave a redness when you snatch that thing off.
Police were left with many questions. An autopsy provided few answers. The coroner's report revealed broken ribs, skull fractures, and severe contusions from the knees to the top of his head. Lieutenant Jim Redmond recalls the official findings.
The injuries to Jack Jones were as a result of blunt force trauma. The injuries were indicative of a bat or some type of club.
The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves throughout the community. Detectives were baffled.
The Joneses lived in a nice neighborhood in the Lake Asbury area of Clay County. Why did somebody pick out this house? In this affluent neighborhood, quiet, peaceful, very peaceful, quiet neighborhood. Why did they just pick this house out at random to come in and commit this crime? It just wasn't right.
Come on, Linda.
Investigators hoped Jones's widow might shed some light on the case. Her response, however, surprised them.
Linda felt a need to have an attorney right away and indicated that we couldn't contact her.
Her behavior, though legal, seemed odd.
Why would she get an attorney? You know, why would a victim whose husband was murdered, why would she need an attorney?
Investigators began canvassing the neighborhood. They hoped someone might have seen something that would pinpoint the killer.
We learned of Jack and Linda's relationship from various people, and it was a stormy relationship. Supposedly, they just weren't happy.
According to neighbors, Jack Jones was having an affair, and Linda had discovered it. One neighbor noticed a suspicious vehicle parked outside the Joneses' residence at the time of the murder.
It was a maroon van, and it had dark tinted windows. And it left the scene, high rate of speed, no lights on.
In nearby Jacksonville, police tracked down Samantha Thomas, the girlfriend of Jack Jones. The two had been romantically involved for several months. The young woman claimed that Jack was planning to divorce his wife. But Linda had threatened suicide. The girlfriend also told police of another incident 1 week before the murder. On October 31st, outside her home, Thomas's car was vandalized, the tires slashed. It could have been just a Halloween prank. But according to his girlfriend, Jack Jones felt differently.
Jack felt like Linda was behind it just due to all the ruckus she was raising about Samantha and his relationship.
The story seemed a bit odd, but Waugh's next find only increased his suspicions. According to their insurance policy, Linda Jones would receive $500,000 in the event of her husband's death. It was a compelling motive, but to prove murder, investigators would have to turn to the evidence. Though Linda Jones maintained her silence, the duct tape spoke volumes. Dawn Walters, a crime analyst with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, examined scraps of tape collected by police at the crime scene. Minute details grabbed her attention.
Some of the duct tape that was submitted was pulled apart or torn apart, and some of the duct tape that was submitted appeared to have been cut.
Duct tape found on the victim was stretched and frayed, signs that the man had struggled to break free. Tape wrapped around the wrists of his wife, however, bore a tiny triangular pattern.
The duct tape was determined to have been cut by what appeared to be pinking shears or another similar cutting instrument.
Walters also looked for fingerprints, but none were visible. at least not to the naked eye.
I decided to use the cyanoacrylate ester fuming process, otherwise known as the superglue process. The superglue fuming process is done by adding superglue drops to sodium hydroxide soaked cotton, which then begins to fume, and these fumes will adhere to the latent print residue that's present on an item. Then I used white fingerprint powder to further enhance the prints.
Within seconds, an image came into view. Linda Jones had not torn the duct tape from her wrists. And now police had not one, but 2 fingerprints to prove it. Someone had cut her free on the night of the murder. In 1995, Florida police were on the hunt for 3 masked intruders who bludgeoned a man in his home. After weeks of investigation, Lieutenant Tom Waugh had just 2 significant clues: a pair of fingerprints left at the scene and a mysterious maroon van. The van remained unidentified. The fingerprints matched no one on file. According to information gathered by police, the victim was a used car salesman with no known enemies and a marriage on the rocks. Waugh suspected the victim's wife was involved, but she could not have acted alone.
Not too far into this investigation after the death of Jack Jones, I had felt like that this was going to be a murder for hire.
Police then got a tip that confirmed their suspicions.
Camera, there was a diamond ring.
An anonymous source accused a local man of being involved in the crime. He was a landscaper named Donald Bradley. Police took a closer look at him.
We determined that Donald Bradley owned a maroon van with dark tinted windows.
The description of the van matched the one police were looking for. A review of his landscaping business finances led to the accounting office in Jacksonville, where Linda Jones worked.
Linda Jones did Donald Bradley's taxes and did work for him. She knew him, and boom, right away, he was coming into focus in this case. One of the things I do routinely when somebody is identified as a suspect, I would start finding out who are they calling.
In Donald Bradley's case, it was not only who, but when.
This is the night of the murder. I got Donald Bradley's cell phone.
Cell phone records indicated he'd made 3 calls to the Jones house on November 7th, all around the time the crime occurred. On January 22nd, 1996, Lieutenants Tom Waugh and Jim Redmond interviewed their suspect at his home in Orange Park, Florida.
Sheriff's Office, Lieutenant Jim Redmond.
Bradley admitted he knew the Joneses, but said he had no knowledge of the crime. He told police he'd been out driving for part of the evening in question.
What was the last 4?
When we talked with him that day, he was very arrogant.
Detectives soon revealed their hand.
Yeah, well, we got a 911 call. When we started telling him about the phone calls to the house, he said, yes, it was concerning taxes. And then he was very, very nervous, and you could tell he kind of didn't know where to go but hold his composure. I would ask him, Donald, how could Linda be talking about taxes with you on the telephone when she's duct taped and her husband's being beat to death and some guy's sitting on her in the living room of their house? I mean, how could this happen? And he couldn't answer that.
For Lieutenant Redmond, Donald Bradley's story was unbelievable.
We felt pretty confident at that point that he was somehow involved with the murder of Jack Jones.
All the detectives had was a hunch. To make an arrest, they needed evidence. they got a search warrant to seize Bradley's van. Blood, hair, carpet fibers. Investigators searched for anything that might link Donald Bradley to the killing of Jack Jones. But the van was spotless. It had been scrubbed clean. Detectives caught a break several weeks later when Bradley was arrested on an unrelated charge. They interrogated the suspect, who changed his story slightly. He admitted Linda Jones had approached him to kill her husband. But he claimed he had refused.
Bradley made up a story about Linda having murdered Jack Jones and used this African war club to do it with.
His story seemed implausible. But with his fingerprints now in the system, they could finally compare his prints to those found on the duct tape. For investigators, it was one step forward, 2 steps back. Bradley's prints did not match, which meant at least one more accomplice was still on the loose. In 1995, Florida officials believed that Linda Jones had hired a local landscaper named Donald Bradley to kill her husband. But an unidentified fingerprint indicated that at least one other man had taken part in the crime. In September 1996, Jeremy Harrison, a longtime employee of Bradley's landscaping business, had been picked up on an unrelated charge. Police wanted to talk with him about the Jones murder. Prosecutor Timothy Collins.
Mrs. Jones' initial report at the time of the homicide was that 3 individuals were involved. I think what you generally find in these kind of cases is that in every lie there's a thread of truth. So in looking at the crime scene, it was pretty clear that more than one person was involved. It was then a matter of trying to determine who and how many other people were with him.
Would you stand up for me?
So the critical decision then was to find that fingerprint, who it belonged to.
Fingerprint specialist Dawn Walters received Harrison's ink print to compare with evidence on file.
To compare latent prints, I look for the individual characteristics that are present in the latent print and the inked print. Characteristics such as dots and ending ridges and bifurcations. I was able to identify the 2 latent fingerprints on the tape.
The prints belonged to Jeremy Harrison. Finally, they had their proof. They presented what they had found to Harrison. He started to talk.
He had no problems in telling us that he was involved in the murder and that Bradley was involved in the murder. But there was a third person, and he wouldn't discuss who that third person was, and he was holding back for a reason.
Harrison wouldn't point his finger at the third suspect. It seemed the investigator had hit another brick wall. Then they learned of a family connection that seemed likely to provide them with the break they so desperately needed.
It was shortly thereafter that we learned of his brother.
Jonathan Harrison was picked up for questioning.
We left the door open in the interview room, and we let his brother walk by. And his brother looked at him and said, "I told him everything, give it up, bro."
After eluding suspicion for nearly a year, both Jeremy and Jonathan Harrison confessed. According to the Harrison brothers, the weapon used on the night of the crime was an ancient Zulu warrior stick.
Yeah, I think
the artifact had been stolen from a local man who hunted big game in Africa. The hunter provided a full description of the club, but it was never recovered by police. On September 14, 1996, law enforcement officials arrested Donald Bradley and charged him with murder and conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. That same day, investigators closed in on Linda Jones. A woman betrayed by an unfaithful spouse and her own unrestrained brutality.
Linda Jones wanted her husband back. When she finally came to the conclusion that that was never going to happen, then it became a matter of money.
Will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to have an attorney.
And I guess in her own mind, she felt like she was not going to get the kind of money she desired from a divorce.
Investigators pieced together the events that led to Jack Jones's murder.
According to the brothers, Donald had contacted him. He said he would pay him $100 apiece to go beat this guy up. And that's what they thought they were going to do.
Donald Bradley had other plans. After calling Linda Jones several times that evening, making sure their victim was in place, the Harrison brothers burst through the front door, which Linda had left unlocked. Bradley attacked from a side entrance. Bradley grabbed the Zulu warrior stick and proceeded to bludgeon the man in a ruthless fury. Linda's wrists were taped and then cut free, and the men disappeared into the night.
Go out that way.
Later that evening, the men destroyed all evidence, burning the ski masks, their bloody clothes, and the Zulu Warrior Club. Jeremy and Jonathan Harrison pled guilty to felony third-degree murder. They were sentenced to 10 years, 6 months. A jury found Donald Bradley guilty of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and burglary with a firearm. He was sentenced to die in the electric chair. Linda Jones was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In a murder for hire, police must not only ID a killer, but the guilty party who concocted the crime. Life insurance, cell phone calls, and suspect behavior provide guideposts for police. But it's often the tiniest evidence that speaks the loudest, and a microscope that shows who must pay the price of murder. In a small town outside of Fort Worth, Texas, a truck driver leaves home, never to return. Authorities suspect something is terribly wrong. Weeks pass as forensic investigators search for even the smallest clues, only to find what they feared in their own backyard. In Canada, 2 people die suddenly of unknown causes, and their deaths may not be as coincidental as they first appear. But a mixture of intuition and science leads detectives on a journey to uncover the deadly answers half a world away. Perpetrators try to disguise their actions to avoid prosecution. Yet forensic investigators, using advanced techniques, can uncover their crimes, revealing the silent killers. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Graham, Texas, lies in the grasslands just west of Fort Worth. The quaint cowboy town, surrounded by cattle and horse ranches, has a down-home family feel, where picturesque scenery rarely doubles as a crime scene. On January 20th, 1996, the Young County Sheriff's Office received a call from T.J. Ryan's parents.
You need police, fire, or ambulance?
Their son was missing, and they were concerned. The 6'6", 300-pound, 27-year-old man had disappeared into thin air.
Wednesday. He's been missing since Wednesday.
Okay, does he have a girlfriend?
TJ's mother informed police that her son worked as a long-haul trucker transporting cattle.
She said that they had an argument.
She was worried because he had not reported to work for several days.
I don't believe that because he would have come to my house.
Young County Sheriff Kerry Pettis was the first to look into TJ's whereabouts. Sheriff Pettis knew most of the county's citizens, so he was acquainted with the easygoing trucker.
He was a good person. He was a young man that rodeoed, drove cattle trucks, helped gather cattle. He just worked around agriculture all his life. Was the same as any young person is. Always wore a big hat, always wore boots, generally speaking.
Since it was out of character for TJ to miss work without checking in, police hoped his employer might have some information about his whereabouts.
How many years?
TJ's boss told him his girlfriend, Helen Moore, had phoned a few days earlier, explaining he was too sick to come in to work.
Because he lived with his girlfriend.
So we began the process of following up. Did he have girlfriends? Did he have a drug habit? Where could he have gone?
The sheriff put out a missing persons report to the surrounding areas in hopes of some news about the missing trucker.
On Monday, we began, as word got out in the community, we began getting hundreds of calls of, well, I saw him here. I think he went there. So on and so forth. And those things had to all be run down, and it was very time-consuming.
The sheriff met with Chief Deputy Gary Barnett to discuss the case. He also called in Texas Ranger Marshall Brown, who worked for the district attorney's office handling special cases. Together, they focused on finding T.J. Ryan. Since T.J.'s boss said Helen Moore called in sick on her boyfriend's behalf, Ranger Brown and Deputy Barnett decided to pay her a visit. Helen and TJ lived together on a small ranch where they kept some livestock and a few horses.
Gary Barnett, Chief Deputy, Young County Sheriff's Department.
The couple had been involved for over 5 years.
Talk to us.
Sure.
Helen told the officers that she and TJ were arguing over finances.
About 4 days ago.
She said he stormed out of the house and she hadn't seen him since.
Shirt, I think.
She told Ranger Brown this wasn't the first time something like this had happened.
He always comes back, though. He'll be back.
At the house, Ranger Brown noticed what appeared to be bloodstains on the front porch. Helen became agitated and quickly explained that a stray dog had attacked their pet pot-bellied pig.
Yeah, the blood's from our pig.
The pig's wounds were so severe that he could not be saved. She asked her son to shoot it.
Where's Pig at?
Helen then told the officers that she had placed the carcass in a horse trailer.
Do you mind if we...
Ranger Brown wanted to look around inside.
I don't mind.
Would you go with us?
Sure.
Okay.
Although everything appeared to be in order, one thing caught his eye. He noticed the floor. It looked as if the carpet had been removed.
I took it out and burned it.
Helen said the carpet was one of the things she and TJ were arguing over.
He was complaining how messy the house was.
She said he yelled at her because the carpet was filthy and that she was a bad housekeeper. She wanted to make him happy, so she tore it up and took it outside. She explained that the carpeting was too heavy to drag to the side of the road, so she thought it would be easier to burn it.
Yeah, why don't you clean the house up once in a while? Was there something on the carpet that you didn't want us to see?
Well, no, care if y'all saw it. We had the
Helen denied any wrongdoing.
It was messy from the pig. He was
she simply was getting rid of some old carpet.
About how messy the carpet was, so I just took it outside and burned it.
Investigators had come up empty at the ranch. They were no closer to finding T.J. Ryan. But that was about to change. In neighboring Palo Pinto County, a resident of the Possum Lake area called authorities. He saw what he believed to be a deer carcass shot by poachers hiding on his land. Constable Noah Bragg was dispatched to the scene. He was horrified by what he saw in the scrubby prairie grass.
1156 Palo Pinto, gonna need the sheriff and investigator here, please. We've got human remains.
Hello?
Constable Bragg reported the torso was that of a large white male.
Okay, we'll be on our way. Be there in a minute. Marshal, we gotta go.
Barnett and Brown immediately left for the crime scene, fearing their missing person case had now become a murder. When they arrived, Palo Pinto police had already roped off the area. Investigators noticed something strange right away. There wasn't a large amount of blood around the torso. Given the severity of the dismemberment, officers speculated that the victim had most likely been killed somewhere else and then dumped in the grass. Further examination of the torso revealed even more clues. They believed whoever cut up this body knew something about anatomy. The legs and buttocks had been removed at the joint. The hands were detached at the wrists in the same manner. The victim's head and neck were also missing. Investigators noticed an abrasion around the victim's waist. Ranger Brown had several initial theories.
In a drug-related crime, they do dismember bodies to keep the body from being identified. And in this case, that's what it appeared to be in.
The torso was removed and sent to the coroner's office for an autopsy. Investigators would have to wait for DNA tests before they would know if, in fact, this was the body of T.J. Ryan. In Young County, Texas, a trucker named T.J. Ryan was reported missing. A few days later, a dismembered torso was discovered in a remote field in nearby Palo Pinto County. Investigators speculated the gruesome murder might be a result of a drug deal gone bad. And now they waited for DNA results in the hopes of making a positive identification to see if, in fact, it was the missing trucker. At the scene, investigators gathered more clues. They noticed coastal Bermuda hay, a commonly used stock feed, around the torso. Smears of manure were present, as were prickly pear needles. They collected these samples for further analysis. Texas Ranger Brown and his team found other peculiar clues.
There was a black plastic bag laying next to the torso. Also, there was a piece of wood that was found at the scene that had red paint on it, which appeared that the vehicle had ran over and maybe the paint from the vehicle was on the wood. And that was basically the physical evidence that was at the scene.
Officers noticed tire impressions in the loose soil. There were two separate and distinct sets of tire tracks. It appeared as if a truck pulling a trailer had driven up near the torso. While the soil was too powdery to obtain imprint samples, the officers documented the size and characteristics of the tire treads. They also measured the tracks to determine the turning radius of the vehicle. At the Dallas County Medical Examiner's office, the torso was processed. Pathologists made a detailed report of the victim's wounds. They determined that a knife or a fine-tooth saw was used to dismember the body. They also believed the abrasion across the victim's waist was caused by a rope. DNA samples were collected to help determine if, in fact, this was the body of T.J. Ryan. They were sent out for analysis. Investigators also sent the biological samples to the lab for further toxicology screenings in hopes of proving their drug theory. But what the lab proved shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The lab report informed Sheriff Pettis there were fatal levels of morphine in the victim's body. But no one knew whose torso they were investigating. The answer lay deep within the body's DNA, but the test results were days away. Investigators continued to search for other body parts and additional evidence. Search and rescue teams combed the surrounding areas where the torso was found. Forensic cadaver dogs, specially trained to alert on human remains, were also called in to aid in the search. Despite this effort, no further evidence was found. At the Torrent County Medical Examiner's office, senior forensic DNA analyst Carolyn Van Winkle used a reverse paternity test to make a positive identification on T.J. Ryan. Sheriff Pettis was now officially heading up a murder investigation. And he decided to go back to the last known person who saw T.J. Ryan alive, his girlfriend, Helen Moore. He needed answers. Sheriff Pettis wanted to take another look at the ranch. He was particularly interested in the blood on the porch, which Moore said came from an injured pig. Crime scene investigators took samples of the blood. Since Helen said she transported the pig in the horse trailer, Pettis moved it to the impound lot. Investigators would make a more detailed inspection at the police lab.
This is Carolyn Van.
Carolyn Van Winkle examined the blood samples taken from the porch.
That blood came back to be pig blood. It wasn't human.
Van Winkle's test confirmed the sample taken from the porch was in fact from a pig. It appeared that Helen Moore was not lying. But investigators were still not convinced she was telling the whole truth. They believed she was holding back something. They just didn't know what it was. The Young County forensic team examined the truck and trailer taken from Helen's ranch. They discovered prickly pine needles embedded in the tires. Investigators collected samples in order to compare it to similar plant material found where the torso had been left. Knowing horse manure was also present near the remains, they also gathered manure samples. Inside the samples were visible specks of red that appeared to be chips of paint. They were sent to the lab for analysis. Once again, Vi Hummel Carr brought in a cadaver dog. to determine if a human body was transported in the trailer.
We were requested to do an evidence search of the trailer to see if we could determine if there was any blood or tissue from the victim. I started out doing a perimeter search of the trailer with Mercy, and then we went inside the trailer where she alerted on the floorboards.
The dog confirmed what investigators were beginning to suspect.
The blood was found in the trailer boards and on the axles of the trailer. It had dripped down through the cracks in the boards and come to rest on the axles.
Investigators sent the boards to the lab to see if the blood was human or if it came from the dead pig Helen's son had placed in the trailer. Given that red paint flecks were found in the manure next to the torso, they also extracted paint samples for further analysis. The truck and trailer's turning radius was compared to the calculations taken at the crime scene. Investigators determined that Helen's truck and trailer could have been at the crime scene, but definitive proof was needed. Nothing tied her directly to the murder. Investigators went back to those closest to TJ. Sheriff Pettis looked into Helen Moore's finances.
Hey, let me see it. Hey, Gary, come here and look at this.
The most alarming piece of information was the fact that Helen Moore had recently taken out a $150,000 insurance policy on the life of her boyfriend, TJ Ryan.
Nobody has that kind of claims history.
Investigators now believe they were closer to a suspect.
There's your motive.
If they ever hoped to make an arrest, they needed the science to back up their suspicions. At the forensic lab, Dr. Tam Garland examined the paint scrapings taken from the floorboards of the trailer. They compared these to the red paint flecks embedded in the manure where the torso had been found.
We have found what we believe are red paint chips inside the fecal pads. And so he actually retrieved paint chips from the trailer for us, and we could lay them side by side and match up the different colors. You could match up the colors layer for layer in the chips that he sent us as well as in the chips that we found from the cows. So in our mind, that's pretty much reduces the probability that it's from any other trailer or from any other source.
Dr. Garland determined the cow had eaten the paint chips found in the grass and passed them. Helen's trailer had been at the scene. Forensic examiner Carolyn Van Winkle extracted blood samples from the trailer floorboards. Her analysis revealed the presence of two distinct blood types.
In the trailer, there was samples obtained from the floorboards of the trailer and samples obtained from under those floorboards in the axle of the trailer. Those samples were submitted to the laboratory, and on each one of those samples, human blood was identified, and also pig blood was identified.
Further DNA analysis confirmed that the human blood belonged to TJ Ryan. Sheriff Pettis now had definitive proof that the trailer on Helen Moore's property had transported Ryan's body. He had the evidence he needed to secure an arrest warrant. Helen Moore was arrested and charged with murder. But Sheriff Pettis still needed corroborating evidence that would confirm exactly what had happened. He obtained a search warrant, and his team began a detailed examination of Helen and TJ's ranch house. Investigators used luminol testing to check for blood. It became quickly apparent that Moore had used bleach to scrub the house, erasing any residual surface stains. Any evidence that placed the murder in her home appeared to be gone. Yet when a cadaver dog was brought in, it alerted on evidence the luminol testing could not pick up. This just might be the link detectives needed that would firmly establish where and how the murder took place.
Yeah, I'll see what you got there.
Detectives in Young County, Texas had apprehended Helen Moore, charging her with the murder of her boyfriend, T.J. Ryan. His torso had been found in a remote area, and forensic investigators learned he had toxic levels of morphine in his system. Police discovered TJ's blood in a horse trailer found on Moore's property. Detectives believed Moore had scrubbed her house with bleach, and luminol testing could not reveal exactly where the murder took place. Once again, Vi Hummel Carr brought in a cadaver dog to help find what investigators were looking for.
Inside the Moore residence, Mercy alerted on blood evidence by the rear door, where apparently the body had been dragged through the house. She trailed from the master bedroom through the hallway and into the boys' room, just the way the body had been dragged through the house.
The dog had sensed something underneath a carpet threshold strip. Investigators removed the carpet strip to examine it further in the lab. Inside the residence, they also found prescription bottles of morphine. Pettis learned later that Helen's former husband had cancer. The drug had been prescribed as a painkiller. At the lab, the blood samples taken from the carpet strip were analyzed. The blood was T.J. Ryan's. Sheriff Pettis was now convinced Helen Moore murdered T.J. Ryan inside their home for the insurance money. He confronted her with a possible motive.
She was wanting to purchase another horse and wanted to borrow the money again to do this, and he said no. And I think that may have been the trigger that really set her off. I think she was probably going to do it all along, but I think that set her off.
But Helen admitted nothing. Finally, Pettis showed her the evidence his team had collected. He told her that given these irrefutable facts, the district attorney would seek the death penalty. Realizing her crime had been revealed, Helen Moore told the sheriff what had transpired that fateful night. TJ complained of back pain, and Helen suggested he take some morphine. She gave him a lethal dose. With her kids away at school, Helen proceeded to get rid of the body. But because TJ was over 300 pounds, it would be impossible for her to drag him outside by herself. So she wrapped a lariat around his waist and attached it to the hitch on her pickup. She then proceeded to pull the body out of the house and up into the trailer. Moore, who had experience butchering animals, then cut up the body in the trailer and discarded the parts over 3 counties. Helen Moore was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison and will not be eligible for parole for 30 years. Some find their prey and methods of murder close to home. Other perpetrators travel far and wide to uncover the perfect silent killer. Hamilton, Ontario sits on the northern shores of Lake Ontario. This Canadian city is home to an international population. And in 1996, authorities would discover an exotic method of murder. John Pierce, an insurance investigator, went to the home of Natraj Sukhwinder, a native of India. Pierce needed some additional information to process a recent life insurance claim. As he got out of his car, Pierce felt as if he'd been at this location before. Ranjit Kela, his client, had died a few weeks ago of a heart attack and named Mr. Sukhwinder the beneficiary of his $100,000 life insurance policy.
Hello. Sir. Yes, I'm John Pierce. I'm the insurance.
Both men purchased policies naming the other as beneficiary in the event of their deaths.
Thank you. This is what, sir. Yes, ma'am. I'd like to ask you a few
Sukhwinder told the agent that Ranjit was his nephew and that the young man had lived with him. Pierce was confused. Ranjit's driver's license listed a different address.
Oh, he's my nephew.
Sukhwinder explained that the address was his brother's and that his nephew spent time at both houses. Pierce left the documents with Sukhwinder, who said his brother was in India and he would have him clear up any discrepancies once he returned. As Pierce drove away, something about the case still bothered him. Back at his office, Pierce asked his assistant to pull Sukhwinder's file. As he went through the information, Pierce remembered Sukhwinder had filed another life insurance claim only 16 months earlier. The claim was for Sukhwinder's wife, Priya. She too had died suddenly. Instinctively, he called the Hamilton police. Detective Warren Corral was the lead investigator. Kevin Dinsa, a native of India who spoke fluent Punjabi, was also assigned to the case.
I've interviewed the beneficiary.
The fact that 2 claims were filed in such a relatively short period of time and were purchased by the same individual raised serious concerns.
I understand that you represent 2 separate insurance.
Detective Corral was very suspicious.
Both of the people that died had similar symptomology to their deaths. They were young people who had no medical history.
The report indicated that Priya had complained of headaches for several weeks before her death. She was taking a homeopathic remedy to help alleviate the pain. One day, she suddenly collapsed. Her husband, Natraj Sukhwinder, found her and immediately called 911. Doctors could not revive her, and she lapsed into a coma.
Do you really want to go through with this?
4 days later, at her husband's request, her life support was removed and she died. Dr. David King performed the autopsy on Priya. He was somewhat puzzled by what he found.
Post-mortem showed really a swollen brain, of brain death. And that was about the only significant finding at post-mortem. There was no actual indication of why she had collapsed, no underlying disease process that I could identify at that time.
The hospital drug screen found no trace of street drugs. Cause of death was ruled undetermined. Suckwinder had his wife's remains cremated and sent back to India. Unfortunately, the autopsy did not provide the answers Detective Coral had hoped for. He decided to look into Suckwinder's past. A search in the Canadian criminal database revealed that Suckwinder was arrested for domestic violence. He had hit Priya. He paid a fine and was released. Detectives Coral and Dinsa decided to look into Suckwinder's nephew's death. They began by visiting Ranjit's widow to ask about the night her husband died. She explained that Ranjit had friends over that day, including his uncle, Suckwinder. Ranjit's friends were partying and drinking heavily. But his wife told the detectives Ranjit never drank alcohol, and this night was no exception.
He drank.
She remembered when the guests left, he had complained of a backache and took some pills to alleviate the pain. As he was getting ready for bed, he collapsed. She said she called an ambulance as her husband convulsed on the floor.
Hello?
Ranjit died in the emergency room. The official cause of death? Heart failure.
Well, thank you for the information.
Although his death was ruled a heart attack, Ranjit, like Priya, the first victim, had experienced severe pain, taken medicine, and collapsed on the floor. The detectives went to see Dr. King at Hamilton General. Dr. King's colleague, Dr. Chitra Rao, overheard the detectives' questions and had particular concerns of her own, given the peculiar cause of death.
We discussed the case, and then he asked me whether I had any suggestion. So then I realized, since both are Indian origin, and I know three common poisonings in India is strychnine, arsenic, and chloroform. So I said maybe we should test for those three agents.
Detective Coral wondered if, in fact, the victims had been given the deadly poison.
Now, these are the...
Dr. King, the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsies, gave Detective Coral the tissue samples from the two victims, Priya Suckwinder and Ranjit Kela. Coral delivered these to the Center of Forensic Science for further toxicology testing. But they would have to wait for the results. It took time. Given Dr. Rao's concerns, Coral began researching strychnine poisoning. He learned that the plant it comes from is indigenous to India. Because it is used as a pesticide and a homeopathic medicine, the substance is readily available. The toxic chemical is lethal and is banned in Canada. A small amount, 1/40th of a sugar cube, is enough to cause a horrific death.
It's just a terrible, terrible death. You're conscious while this goes on, while you're in these seizures, these state of seizures, and you basically know that there's impending doom. People that have ingested strychnine will say, "I'm going to die, I'm going to die."
Yeah, I'm Warren Coral.
The detectives went to visit the friend who was drinking with Ranjit and Suckwinder.
We're investigating the... yeah.
Although he said he noticed nothing unusual the night Ranjit died, he did remember Suckwinder gave his nephew a pill for his back pain. He then told the officers he heard a rumor that Suckwinder went back to India after his wife Priya died and remarried there.
I haven't seen him.
And there was one more startling revelation.
Something is funny because...
He also heard his new wife suddenly died, just like Ranjit and Priya. The friend believed Suckwinder had collected on insurance for this wife as well. 3 people were dead. and a pattern was beginning to emerge. In Hamilton, Ontario, 2 young Indian immigrants died suddenly for no apparent reason. The only link between them, one man, Natraj Sukhwinder, the sole beneficiary of life insurance policies taken out on both victims.
Let me ask you this.
And although there were rumors surrounding Sukhwinder, there was no evidence of any kind.
That's my brother's address.
The one solid lead was the toxicology screenings of the second victim, Ranjit Kela. The presence of a lethal poison, strychnine, was discovered. And although illegal in both the US and Canada, the substance is readily available in Sukhwinder's native India. At the Center of Forensic Science, Dr. Joel Mayer examined the samples taken from both victims. Dr. King had saved blood samples from Ranjit. But because Priya had died nearly 18 months earlier, no blood remained, just small blocks of tissue. Due to the limitations of his equipment, Dr. Mayer could not detect the presence of strychnine in Priya's samples. However, he did find evidence of strychnine in Ranjit's blood sample. While Hamilton investigators now believed the young man was poisoned, proving it was another matter. And linking it to the death of Sukhwinder's wife Priya was nearly impossible. They were convinced they had a killer who could strike again at any moment, and they had hit a dead end, fearful they wouldn't be able to stop him. Given the discovery of the poison, detectives Coral and Dinsa decided to question Sukhwinder further. The used car dealer was cooperative at first, until they asked him if he had ever heard of the poison strychnine.
Death of Ranjit Kela.
Warren spoke to him in English, and it became progressively worse when some key questions were being asked of him. And that's when I stepped up and told him that I could speak Punjabi and that we could then speak in his mother tongue. And I don't think he was quite prepared for that, because he kind of got boxed in with that. And so when I was able to converse, he didn't have much room to back away from the questions at that point.
We're going to come back and chat with him.
Although Sukhwinder said he visited with Ranjit the night he died, he insisted he never gave him a pill for his back pain. When they asked him about his wife, Priya, Sukhwinder became sad.
I want you to think about the questions we've asked. I'll talk to you.
But detectives did not believe his display of emotion was genuine. His evasive answers only heightened their suspicions. But that alone was not enough evidence to hold him. The detectives wanted to check out the rumors surrounding Sukhwinder.
It's about a 10.
For that, they needed to go halfway around the world.
Call and see if he's awake.
Sure.
Coral and Dinsa placed a call to Pierre Carrier, the liaison officer at the Canadian High Commission in New Delhi, asking for information on Sukhwinder's background.
Yes, I am. How were you able to follow up those?
Pierre Carrier sent them a fax from Interpol. The rumors proved to be true. Sukhwinder's past was alarming. He did remarry, and his new wife died suddenly, just like his first wife, Priya. They also learned he had 2 sons who died mysteriously shortly after they were born. It was possible that Sukhwinder had not only killed another wife, but had also murdered his 2 infant sons as well.
February 16th, 1996.
Kind of confirms that information.
The trip to India also confirmed Sukhwinder had easy access to strychnine, the poison found in his nephew's blood. Dinsa and Coral felt it was imperative that they travel to India to collect more corroborating evidence concerning his other family's death.
We wanted to determine what the cause of the death was and what the circumstances were. We also learned that the second wife that he had married in India gave birth to twin babies who had also died. So we wanted to determine what their cause of death was and what the circumstances were, and you know, what the connection was with all these deaths and marriages that were occurring immediately after the first wife's death.
They learned that the symptoms of the new wife's death were identical to those of Priya and Ranjit's. The detectives also discovered how easy it was to buy strychnine.
Strychnine is indigenous to India. It's a tree called kapilo tree, and it grows in the northeastern part of India, and it's available readily, and mainly used for homeopathic reasons, but it's also available in its raw form, and sometimes it's used to kill animals, and so it's quite readily available at some of the organic stores and homeopathic stores in India.
In order to get a conviction in Priya's case, Coral and Dinsa would need definitive proof that the poison was present in her tissue samples. It was their hope that forensic science would provide the link they were missing. Hamilton, Ontario detectives Coral and Dinsa were deep into the investigations of 5 mysterious deaths. They discovered strychnine in the blood of one of the victims and believed the others were poisoned as well. It seemed all the evidence was pointing to one suspect, Natraj Sukhwinder, but linking him to the deadly substance proved difficult. The detectives contacted world-renowned Dr. Frederick Reeders, a Pennsylvania-based toxicologist who had advanced equipment calibrated to detect the most minute trace elements. Working with only the small tissue block sample obtained from Sukhwinder's wife Priya, Reeders began a painstaking process. Using this method, Reeder was able to determine that a large amount of strychnine was in Priya's system at the time of her death. Coral and Dinsa now had the proof they needed to arrest Sukhwinder for the murders of his nephew and his wife. Despite hours of interrogation, Sukhwinder continued to maintain innocence.
He gave a caution statement again, stating he continued to say that he did not murder these people. He did not murder his first wife. He did not murder Ranjit. The things that were happening in India were all a coincidence.
Coral and Dinsa obtained a search warrant for his house. They discovered several items that supported the case they had pieced together.
Found something here.
They were hoping to find something more substantial to tie him directly to the strychnine.
The search warrant was for strychnine or any literature related to strychnine, and we didn't find either. But what we did find was some mortar and pestles, which wasn't all that uncommon in Indian homes as spices are being ground for their daily consumption. However, it was our theory that raw strychnine which comes in round brown pestles, was grounded in these mortar and pestles and then either placed in gelatin capsules and given to the victims.
The detectives submitted the evidence they collected to test for the poison. Yet Suckwinder had covered his tracks. Dr. Mayer found no trace of strychnine. But the fact that these items were in his home, coupled with the other evidence they had compiled, gave the detectives a clear picture of how he carried out the crimes. Suckwinder knew his wife was taking medication for her headaches. He ground up the strychnine in the mortar and pestle, then replaced the contents of her capsules with the deadly poison. He had also offered Ranjit a remedy for his back. Little did the man know the pills he took were laced with strychnine. In July of 2001, Suckwinder was convicted of the murder of his wife. He received a life sentence. Later that year, he received an additional life term for the murder of Ranjit Kela.
It was an exhilarating experience. It was a tough fight, and once it was over, it was a very, very big victory for us, and it was a relief. Because of the problems that I've briefly outlined, it was a problem throughout the investigation, throughout the trial. So once we got the conviction, it was a huge relief. Of course, after the second conviction, we were just exhilarated about the whole thing.
Though it may only take a small amount of poison to kill, these toxic chemicals leave a telltale trail only forensic science can trace. And with it, the silent killers come to light, and their heinous crimes become all too clear.